About a month ago, I posted a video on the channel where I showcased a $200 gaming PC build. This build featured some older components including an i7-4790K and a GTX 970. My goal was to sell that build for profit, and shortly after uploading the video, I successfully sold it in a deal where I received $300 in cash and an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 780 in exchange. This meant that I essentially made a $100 profit along with the added value of the GPU. I could have waited longer to potentially make more from the sale, but I felt that it was a fair deal overall. Today, I have another build to share with all of you. This one should be easier to replicate for the total price of $180 that I built it for, but it's also slightly less powerful overall. I put this fairly compact budget system together over a few weeks using mostly used components. My intention, once again, is to flip this system on the local market for a solid profit. In my area, used gaming computers have been fetching higher prices recently, so I'm confident that I'll be able to sell this one easily. This build began when I stumbled upon a great deal on an Asus B150MC motherboard on eBay for just $32, including shipping. This LGA 1151 socketed board supports Intel 6th and 7th generation processors with the B150 chipset. It offers a decent set of features for the price, including multiple PCIe slots and support for DDR4 up to 2400 MHz. To pair with the board, I considered getting an i7-6700, but for around $60 used, it didn't make much sense. Instead, I opted for the i5-6600, which I found on eBay for just $22. This 4-core, 4-threaded Skylake chip built on the 14nm process has a base frequency of 3.3 GHz and a boost frequency of 3.9 GHz, along with a 65-watt TDP. While this i5 isn't exceptionally powerful, it should suffice for a build at this price point. To cool the i5, I opted for the most budget-friendly cooling solution that I could find, which happened to be the Deepcool Theta. I managed to snag it on Amazon for just $5. Having used this cooler before, I can attest that it performs admirably in cooling even more power-hungry processors. In my experience, it outperforms the Intel stock cooler, making a reliable choice for a cheap build like this one. For memory, I managed to secure a solid deal on two 8GB sticks of DDR4 RAM. This 16GB Micron kit cost me just $15 on eBay and should perform well despite the slightly slower 2133 MHz speed. And in a build like this, where price and functionality matter more than aesthetics, fancy heat spreaders or RGB lighting are unnecessary. Moving on to storage, I chose the 512GB Team Group SSD that I've used in previous builds. At just $22 on Amazon, I believe that 512GB is a good starting point and additional game storage can be easily added at a very low cost. The power supply for this build was a great find on Facebook Marketplace, costing me only $20. It is a high-power branded, non-modular 600-watt 80+ white unit that I've seen in pre-built systems before. While I wouldn't recommend pairing a PSU like this with higher-end components, it's more than adequate for a system like this. The graphics card selection for this build was interesting. I wanted to use a card that I already had on hand to offload some components that I was testing or using for content creation. I considered the GTX 780 that I obtained in the previous flip, but the lack of driver support for the 700 series Kepler cards made it unsuitable for running some modern titles and might have made the system harder to sell. I might also end up keeping that GTX 780 as a permanent addition to my collection for future testing. Ultimately, I settled on using the GeForce GTX 960, which I have previously tested in a video. While it only has 2GB of VRAM, it pairs well with the i5-6600, and for esports and older games, the target for this system, the GTX 960 should suffice. The case for this build was the last component I purchased. Finding a good case on the used market for a reasonable price can be challenging. I usually keep my eye out for open box or used deals on Amazon to get a better price and free shipping. This time, I managed to acquire an MATX size Cougar MG 130G for just $40 on the Amazon warehouse. It arrived essentially in new condition, complete with all screws and accessories. For the price, it looks quite decent and was relatively easy to build in. Before I list the system on Facebook Marketplace and attempt to sell it, I wanted to test it in various benchmarks and games to gauge its performance. Given its specifications, I don't expect it to deliver mind-blowing results, but it should handle 1080p resolution in most older AAA titles and esports games at lower settings while maintaining smooth frame rates. I started by testing Unigine Heaven at medium quality with tessellation set to normal. It averaged 65 FPS with a 1% low of 15 FPS. Next, I tested Unigine superposition at 1080p low settings, where it performed admirably with an average of 64 FPS and a 1% low of 55 FPS. This provided a good initial indication of the system's performance. CSGO presented an interesting challenge with the weaker CPU. I anticipated becoming CPU bound in some situations, but not in this first game test. After tweaking the settings, I settled on a mix of medium and high settings with some optional settings disabled. This resulted in some slightly lower GPU usage percentages, but the performance remained excellent with frame rates averaging around 180 FPS at most times. While still encountering a CPU bottleneck in certain scenarios, GTA 5 at 1080p and mostly high settings looked and played great, with an average of around 90 FPS. This result, while expected, demonstrates that a system with older and used components can deliver a terrific experience in older, highly optimized AAA games. Fortnite was tested at 1080p with performance mode, medium view distance, and low textures and meshes. Although it exhibited some occasional stuttering, the frame rates, averaging between 140 and 150 FPS at most times, were sufficient enough for an enjoyable gaming experience, especially if you don't mind sacrificing some graphical fidelity and aren't aiming for a highly competitive play. Lastly, I tested Cyberpunk 2077 to see how the system would handle it. Running at 720p with the medium preset, the benchmarking run yielded an average of 37 FPS and a 1% low of 19 FPS. While this may not provide an ideal gaming experience for some, it's still playable if you're willing to accept the lower resolution. After testing, it's clear that this system will be best suited for someone with realistic expectations of its gaming capabilities. However, I believe that with a few upgrades, such as an i7 CPU and a more powerful GPU, it could offer a better value than investing in a pricier used PC in many cases. My plan is to list this system and hopefully make a modest profit while providing a good deal to someone. I'll be sure to share my results in the next PC flip video. If you wanted to stay updated on my future builds and other content, please consider subscribing to the channel. Additionally, if you have any video suggestions or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, as I'm always interested to hear your input. Thank you.